going to go ahead and call the Select Committee on School Safety to order. And if we could, in honor of, in memory of 9/11, why don't we take a moment of silence before we start our meeting? Thank you all. Let me welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Select Committee on School Safety. The purpose of today's meeting is to hear from the House Appropriations Committee staff on current funding levels for school safety related programs, and then of course to receive our draft recommendations from our subcommittees. First off, I want to make a few comments about how today's process will work, and then I'll make some general comments about the progress of the committee. Following the presentation from House Appropriations, we will receive, and that will be a key word I'll explain in a second, recommendations from each subcommittee chairman. These recommendations are inclusive and comprehensive in nearly everything the subcommittees have looked at and heard. Ultimately, this committee will need to analyze these recommendations, their physical impact, and overall effectiveness, and determine what will be included in our final report to the General Assembly in December. That is not the purpose of today's meeting, however. Today, we will receive the work of all subcommittees and begin our deliberative process. And I would sort of equate it like JLARC. If you've ever been to a JLARC meeting, they have a lot of great recommendations. We don't always take all of those recommendations, and we simply receive the report. That will actually put the report in the bosom of the committee, and then we'll proceed from there. So before I go on, any sort of questions on that? Okay, and I also will reiterate sort of in that point that we're going to ask each subcommittee chairman to present their recommendations, then following each presentation, we'll entertain a motion to receive the recommendations in a block. So that's how that's going to work. Okay? As I was preparing for today's meeting and looking over the draft recommendations from all subcommittees, I was thinking back to March when we began this process. I like the idea of a select committee because it allowed for us to pull together some of the top minds from each standing committee and make sure we approach this important yet complex issue from multiple angles and perspectives. We decided to have our committee structure be largely subcommittee driven, which I think allowed for broader stakeholder access and ensured that we were really diving into each one of these issues. Our subcommittees met throughout the Commonwealth and heard from dozens of stakeholders, academic and industry experts, and constituent groups about ways to improve school safety. We began this process. I promised this would be a do-something committee, and I hope our work thus far has proven that. Good news, a recent JLARC analysis of Virginia's school safety programs found that Virginia is a national leader in school safety efforts. In fact, Governor McDonnell formed a school safety task force during his term that produced numerous recommendations that the General Assembly enacted. Many other states have looked to Virginia as a model for school safety, and I have every intention of that continuing to be the case. We are blessed to have good policies in place to protect our students, teachers, and schools. We shouldn't settle just for good. We have the opportunity to improve and to get better. That's why we're here today. I would like to thank each of the subcommittees for the time and effort they put into this process, and I look forward to hearing from them shortly. So at this point, I'm going to ask Susan Hogue, Susan Massert, and David Reynolds to present an overview of school safety funding. I think Susan Hogue's going to kick us off. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the introduction. Give me a quick second here to fire this puppy up. All right, I'm going to kick us off, you're exactly right, with the portion for direct aid to public education. I'm going to start by touching on a couple of budget items that are driven and set out by state code, in particular Title 22 for the SOQ requirements. Each school division is required to employ a minimum of number of guidance counselors relative to the number of students in their membership. I've listed out there for you on the middle of the slide what those ratios are in terms of positions to the number of students for elementary, middle, and high. There is some flexibility in the budget, in the code language that allows the school divisions to determine the actual placement of those counselors according to their area of greatest need. So regardless of whether or not the position got generated because of the elementary or middle or high school enrollment, the school division can determine, hey, I need to have 2 or 3 more counselors at a particular school, giving them the flexibility to do that. Schools also have to provide student-based services and support positions such as, and I've listed those, a couple of examples there for you, like social workers and their administrative counterparts, guidance administrative positions, and those would be in addition to regular counselors. Attendance support positions relative to truancy and to dropout prevention, along with health and behavioral positions like school nurses and school psychologists. And just at the very bottom there, you see that little tiny footnote, Appendix A. There's more of a complete listing and category of types of different support positions. And as we go through our presentation today, there'll be references within the slides that will give you some additional information that we hope will be useful to you as you go through your deliberations in the future. So moving on, the state provides funding for the counselors and support positions, which are included in the SOQ Basic Aid allocation using that prescribed SOQ formula for the counselors, and then a calculated ratio for support positions and school nurses by using a statewide prevailing average cost basis. And although there's no real ratio requirements for the employment of any specific type of support positions, like those school counselors, the school psychologists or social workers, a school can employ and report them as a support position, which the state funds using that ratio, and it's 1 support position, if you will, based on that prevailing cost, for every 4 positions that are instructionally calculated using the SOQ requirements. And those instructional positions are teachers, librarians, counselors, principals, and assistant principals. And just to kind of give you some perspective for guidance counselors, I've estimated that there's about $114 million and about almost 3,000 funded SOQ positions each year for the schools that the state has calculated. And then also for the support position classification, the budget includes about $534 million each year. But there's no specific number of FTEs necessarily that's set out and required for any one particular support position. And then lastly, school nurses are actually calculated outside of that 1-to-4 ratio. And again, but it uses the prevailing cost average, and it's estimated about at $65 million each year. Again, just to kind of give you all the big picture on a statewide basis. Moving on, next couple of slides have some budget changes that we wanted to touch on that also provide some additional student support. At-risk add-on, many of y'all have heard about that program. During session, action increased the top funding range from 13% add-on to now 14%, which was about $7.1 million in the second year. So now collectively for this particular program, you have budgeted just over $100 million in the first year and then $107 million in the second year. The allocations are based on the number of students eligible for free lunch, and the schools have to use that funding to support approved programs for at-risk students. And I've listed there for you in the budget language what those approved positions are in that middle of the slide bullet. And also, I just wanted to point out to you, all that language that you see that's in italics and underlined is new language you all added and adopted this session, and I'm going to point that out to you. You can use the at-risk add-on money for teacher recruitment programs and incentives, and then also, more importantly, as we're talking today, hiring of additional school guidance counselors. And then there's language for reporting, which we'll just skip past that. So that's the at-risk add-on. For the positive behavioral interventions and support program, the budget added $550,000 each year now for a revised total of 1.6 in both years of the biennium. As you may recall, the program was created with the goal to improve school climate and to reduce disruptive behavior in the classroom. and the funds are allocated on a competitive basis to the schools that can demonstrate positive school outcome objectives like reductions in disciplinary referrals or out-of-school suspension rates. Divisions with the schools that have reported high suspension rates are given some prioritization when DOE is awarding the grants. And also wanted to point out to you, one of the good things about the program is there is no local match requirement, so it's dollars going to the schools and 100% to support the program from the state. And then also, towards the bottom of the slide there, DOE has funding to develop and administer aspects of the program for statewide training, for technical assistance, and on-site coaching for the teachers and administrators so that they understand what it means to have, effective programs to help reduce disruptive behavior and have fewer suspensions. At the very bottom there, that table just real quickly gives you the history of what the funding has been since the inception of the program back in 2014. Moving forward, you see the allocations for the direct aid, and then also the middle of that table, I show you the number of schools that are participating and have participated in the particular program thus far. For 19 and 20, DOE hasn't finally awarded those dollars out yet, so I can't tell you what they are. And then there's a little bit of money there for the Department of Education. PBIS, as you may know, works with the Virginia Tiered Systems of Support, which initially grew out of that Response to Intervention Initiative that began back in 2007. And in summary, this particular program aligns academics, behavior, and social emotional wellness into sort of like a single decision-making model or package, if you will, that establishes the support needed for the schools to be the sort of that effective learning environment for all the students that they have. Just to skip one past for the sake of time here, DOE had received, you all gave them $250,000 in new money this year for the program, and in addition, they currently have $1.5 million in federal dollars that came from a personal development grant. And then in the DOE and the direct aid budget, there's about $700,000, also federal dollars, in 19, just in 19, for the fifth and final year of a school climate transformation grant. And as any of you all that know me, I'm a big fan of state maps, and this is the first of several that you'll see in my presentation this morning. It kind of just shows you the current participation for the school divisions in the current 19 school year. All right. Moving on, Communities and Schools Initiative. There's about $1.2 million each year in the budget for the program, and currently those funds are targeted with partnership affiliates in Petersburg, Richmond City, Chesterfield, and the Hampton Roads area collectively, and then also Southwest Virginia in a collective sense. CIS's mission is to provide students with a community of support to kind of help them stay in school and to help them gain life skills towards becoming successful in life. It sort of is that oil in the machine, if you will, beyond necessarily the academics, and sort of helps them, gives them the extra little oomph. CSA works with CIS, sorry, I've got the other one on my mind as well. CIS works with local businesses, social service agencies, healthcare providers, and volunteers to provide sort of that coordinated system of student services to mostly at-risk students in the schools. And then also I just wanted to point out this past session, you all added new language that directs them to work with and assist community school organization in developing opportunities to establish a program in those interested schools. All right. Security equipment grant. Back in 2013 session, y'all established the security equipment fund with a total of $30 million for revolving, $30 million in each year collectively over 5 years for awards to be given to schools with a maximum of $6 million allocated each year. First year, about 1.3 was allocated to pay for the debt service, and it's been funded through the Literary Fund ever since. Again, there's an appendix in the back of the book and the presentation that will give you the specificity on the language for the fund itself. School divisions, in summary, are eligible to receive up to $100,000 for a grant each year, and they can apply annually if they want to for their schools' equipment projects. Schools do have to provide a 25% match of the awarded grant total, and there is an exception, so the state superintendent can waive that local match requirement if you have an LCI that's less than 0.20. And then we have 3 school divisions that have 2.0 or less in their LCI, and I've listed those out for you. Next couple of slides. Next slide in particular touches on sort of the application process, but again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave that in there for your reference. And then the slide following that deals with the actual funding history for the security equipment projects. Again, I'm just going to draw your attention down to the bottom and speak to that. Started in 2013, and you can see that we had awarded $7.4 million out of $8.3 in requested projects. And then as you move across the table, you see for each fiscal year the amount that was awarded, which is basically the $7.5 million going forward, and then it has been sort of trending up to this past 2017. Don't have 18 yet in terms of final numbers, but DOE is working on that. And so that gap in between those two lines basically is the difference between the annual totals that have been funded versus sort of an unmet need, if you will, for requested projects. So for example, taking 17 as the example, they had requested 10.5, we funded 7.5, so that $3 million, the state would need to offer up another 2.4, and the local match would be about $600,000 going forward, just as sort of a reference. And again, here are my favorite Virginia maps. The first one at the top shows you those school divisions that applied for security equipment grants this past school year. That's 103 out of the 132. And then the state map at the bottom shows you again sort of the history over the last 5 years on an cumulative basis, the number of school divisions that have gotten some portion of an award during that 5-year period. All right, just want to take a quick minute to touch on some legislation that came forward out of the 18 session that's in code per se. House Bill 1604 requires classroom instruction now on health to be included as part of the new standard to recognize multiple dimensions of health by including mental health and the relationship of physical and health, so that it would help students understand attitudes and behaviors that would promote their health and well-being overall. The bill also directed Board of Ed to start reviewing and updating that health SOL for students in the 9th and 10th grade to include that mental health aspect. And DOE is working on that right now. They're going to be presenting at the October board meeting to sort of begin the process for that implementation. Again, I've included a timeline for you there as Appendix E. And then just real quick, I want to step back and to wrap up the K-12 section this morning, I'd feel remiss if I didn't mention that schools have 100% flexibility for this program, Lottery Supplemental, per pupil amount. As you all put a lot of money into it this past session, 43 million the first year and 48 million the second year. And so the school divisions have 100% flexibility on their allocation, and they can use it, again, as they best see fit to suit the needs of their particular school division. And just want to point out right quick, the lower right-hand corner of the table is the action that came out of this session, when you can see the movement across the from left to right. Now we're totaling $234 million in 19 and $239 million in FY20. and it equates to about $336 in the first year and $342 the second year, that school divisions will get on a per-pupil basis, that they can, again, utilize those dollars that best, suit their needs to support their students. Again, there's no local match to it, which is, awesome, so. And if there are any questions, I've sort of ran through it, but for the sake of time this morning, wanted to, move it along, so.
Any questions on K-12? And we'll do the questions at the end of each section. So anybody have a question for Susan Hogue?
Okay.
Great, Susan, thank you.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and members of the Select Committee. I'm just going to take you quickly through Children's Mental Health Services. I know you've seen some of this information before, and I'm just going to try and do a quick recap. Just to remind you that funding for children's behavioral health services come through about three primary sources in the Health and Human Resources budget. First is the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. That flows through them. Money through the CSBs. They also get some federal block grant dollars for mental health and substance abuse prevention and treatment. The Virginia Medicaid program, which I just kind of want to go through that real quickly so you can see the volume of dollars that go to children's mental health in there, and the Children's Services Act. Just want to recap quickly for you the school and campus safety task force recommendations that were made in 2013. I know you saw this in the spring, but just wanted to remind you because I'm going to kind of go through the funding there. The suicide prevention program, implementing a comprehensive one, was part of that. Access to child and adolescent outpatient clinicians and child psychiatrists for behavioral health services. Mental health first aid training and certification was part of that. Developing CIT, crisis intervention team assessment centers, or what we call drop-off centers for law enforcement to use. And then expanding outpatient services to adults. I'm just going to focus today on the children's services. So if you look at the next chart on the page, what I've done here is I've put down the recommendations that came out of 2013, what the initial 2014 budget was for those services, and where we are in fiscal year 2019. So in terms of comprehensive suicide prevention program, we're at about the same place that we funded initially, but that is an annual funding amount. And the Department of Behavioral Health implements that and does regional prevention programs and events. They do classroom materials, social marketing, training and professional development, and some crisis center support. In terms of children and adolescent services to clinicians and child psychiatrists, there were two appropriations back in the 2014 period. The first one was initially based on the recommendations of the 2013 task force. That was $1.9 million. It's grown to $8.4 million. You all have put funding in there over the years. And these are regional programs that include crisis response services. So there may be a crisis center in some of these regions, depending on how the locals have gotten together to provide the services. They target children up through age 17. In the 2014 session, you also appropriated $4 million, which is continued today in the budget. And that was for outpatient services really targeted at transition age youth, and they are in the ages between 17 and 24. So right now what the department is implementing are coordinated specialty teams, again, sort of scattered throughout the Commonwealth, and they target this population and primarily kids who have experienced their first episode of psychosis, so they can get in there and help work with them early on to prevent relapses and do some skill building for those individuals. In terms of mental health first aid training, you started out with $600,000 in the budget in 2014, and that continues today. There's really two modules here, and that's training for those that are dealing with adults and those who are dealing with children. As of last fiscal year, they trained about 757 instructors, and they trained about 32,000 youth and adults in first aid. So that's quite an accomplishment. In terms of the CIT assessment centers, the original appropriation, actually you started that in about 2012. put in about $600,000 in 2014 budget. You put in another $900,000, and that's grown to $12.3 million. You put some money in this last session, bringing that up. So that we will, once the 6 new centers get put online, we'll have a total of 38 centers. I will say it's a local decision on whether to serve children. You remember, these are primarily to kind of divert individuals from landing up in jails, go to the drop-off center, so maybe they can figure out whether they're going to need temporary detention or emergency custody order, or maybe stabilize them at that point in time. But a number of these programs have found that they will serve children because it makes sense, even though the child is not, headed to jail. They are headed towards a significant crisis, and they can do some diversion there. So a number of them do that. Continuing on in the Department of Behavioral Health Services, that's correct. The 2017 General Assembly also adopted the STEP Virginia legislation that I think most of you have heard about or are a little bit familiar with. That will serve children and adults. You funded in now funding for all the CSBs to provide same-day access to services. That's about a total of $13.7 million general fund, and a little bit of Medicaid dollars. Primary care screening services and monitoring for health risks. You have put money in the budget to phase that in. That will phase in according to the statutory requirements and be completely phased in by fiscal year 2020 at all 40 CSBs. And they will do that kind of coordination to make sure that their health risks are being addressed as well. In terms of outpatient services, you accelerated the funding that would have been required by statute for that. You put in $15 million in fiscal year 2020 to begin phasing in a core set of services at all community service boards. The department is working towards coming up with what that definition is, and I think they're working closely with the community service boards on that. And I anticipate that will include children's services as well. And then you put some money in also to accelerate the STEP Virginia funding for detoxification services in 2020. There's some other services in the behavioral health department for children, and this is a typo, that should be 2018 General Assembly. You provided $7 million over the biennium to fund an alternative transportation system for adults and children that would be subject to a temporary detention order. They're beginning to figure out exactly how they're going to implement that right now, and that will provide a trauma-informed, safe, and effective means for delivering services to children while they're, being transported to services and minimizing the trauma. There's also the federal block grant dollars from the Federal Mental Health Block Grant and the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant that provide selective services for children's mental health and substance abuse treatment services. I don't have the numbers for you right now. The latest, the department is working on looking at those numbers to try and discern which are specifically for children's services. A lot of those block grant dollars that go out, some of them go to the state government, some of them go to the local government, some of them go to nonprofit advocacy organizations for a lot of different things. But just wanted to give you a flavor for what some of those grants are. For instance, the department did receive some funding to do about $1 million per year over a multi-year period, and that ends in September 2020, to do some regional programs to expand access to services for children that have co-occurring serious emotional disorder and substance abuse issues. There's also an amount of money that goes over a multi-year period of time to the Department of Health for a Virginia Youth Suicide Prevention Program as well, and that finishes up in 2022. I want to go on to Medicaid real quickly. Medicaid, as you know, provides a wide array of children's behavioral health services. I've listed those out for you. They also provide about $35 million in the last year to school health services. And as part of that, if identified in the child's IEP, it would include psychological services provided by a psychologist or a school social worker. That's funding that goes, that gets billed through the schools. And starting this past August, as many of you might know, the Department of Medical Assistance Services is phasing in the Medallion 4.0 program, which integrates medical and behavioral health services through Medicaid managed care organizations. That will be fully phased in by January 1, and it's going to, I think, maybe change the landscape a little bit on how services are being provided and possibly really start hitting a lot of these issues that perhaps some folks didn't come forward and get services for. I will say that that's going to be a capitated rate, so it kind of complicates the data analysis in terms of looking at how specific services are utilized. We're going to be working through that in the next year or so, trying to sift through some of the encounter data that the HMOs provide to kind of get back to you with information that you want on specific services that are provided. That's going to be also complicated by the fact that the agency is undergoing a major systems redesign right now and implementation. So, you know, that'll be sort of a cross that we all have to bear, if we will. In terms of large amounts of Medicaid funding for children's behavioral health services, I did want to point out to you that there are some large amounts in the Medicaid agency, the largest being therapeutic day treatment, $169 million in FY18 for those services. And those are largely delivered in school settings, largely by private providers. They can do, I've sort of described there for you, psychotherapeutic interventions that they do with kids. Could be counseling, could be skill building, could be medication education, those kinds of things. About 93% of those amounts are provided in school settings. Intensive in-home services, $146 million. And those are services that are designed to keep children in the home and decrease their out-of-family placements. So they may do also outpatient therapy, counseling, crisis intervention, and transition services for kids that are coming back to the home from an institutional setting. There's about $27 million in mental health case management. If you go to the next slide, you'll see there's also about $79 million in residential treatment centers. Those are institutional-based services for children. And then therapeutic group homes, Medicaid reimbursed about $11 million in FY18. Again, those would be therapeutic support services that are provided through group homes. It doesn't include room and board. Treatment, foster care, case management, that's a smaller amount, about $3.5 million, and that assists foster care families in helping provide services to children that are in their homes. And then I want to go on to the Children's Services Act. As you remember, CSA was enacted back in 1993 to do a collaborative system for at-risk youth and families. There are local multidisciplinary teams that are responsible for coordinating those services for children with emotional and behavioral challenges and their families. Localities are mandated to serve roughly 3 groups of children, those that are special education children, those in foster care, and children requiring mental health services to avoid placement in foster care. Just to kind of point out to you, because this came up, I think you were talking a little bit about in the last subcommittee meeting, but families can approach their FAP teams in the locality to request services, so it's not quite as restrictive as it used to be in the past, particularly if they're at risk for institutional placements or placements in foster care. That program served about 16,000 kids. This is FY17 data because they're still finishing up the year. CSA closes out in September as opposed to June like a lot of other programs. There's about 12,000 kids that received community-based residential, congregate, or therapeutic foster care services, and about 3,800 that were special education private day placement services. Just to give you an idea of CSA expenditures and where they're going, if you kind of take away the special ed private placement, you can see sort of the services for children with behavioral health needs. Community-based services were about 13% of expenditures. Residential and congregate were about 21% at $79 million. And then you had foster care therapeutic treatment, and that was about $97 million, or about 25% of CSA expenditures. And there's a couple of tables in the back under Appendix G that just talks a little bit about the growth in CSA. But I will say in CSA, we are seeing sort of a level funding of the expenditures for behavioral health and therapeutic foster care services. That is not growing right now. What's growing in that program is special ed private day placements. So it's kind of on a level field right now. That pretty much takes it to Susan again. David is unfortunately out very sick today, so Susan's going to do his presentation.
Any questions for Susan Master before you go on? Yes. Delegate Watts.
Clarification, please. So when it comes to Medicaid covering any of these services, do I understand that you have to have an IEP or be court-ordered through the foster care system?
Not in Medicaid. If you fit the Medicaid eligibility requirements, you can receive services. You might have some court orders for children coming into the CSA program for children in need of services, or they may be foster care placements that way, but also it can be a family that has risk of giving up their child to foster care, and I don't know, that can be a fairly broad definition.
Follow up.
Delegate Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the reason for my question, then some of the behavioral mental health issues identified in the schools for general population, not IEP, might benefit from Medicaid services being available through their families.
Yes, and I would say probably a number of them are. If they're Medicaid eligible, they may be getting therapeutic day treatment services right in the school on a daily basis or weekly basis or, monthly basis kind of thing, or even through the summertime. So, yeah, if they've been identified, a lot of the schools use the service providers if they're eligible for Medicaid.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Susan, I had a couple of questions about CSA. Does this program not lend itself to managed care at all, or has anyone thought about a managed care approach to CSA?
I would say that there are a number of children in CSA that are funded through the Medicaid program, so they are going to be in the managed care program, would be my guess, unless, for some vagary they came in and they're waiting 2 months to get assigned to a managed care organization. But yeah, I think they're going to have the integration going on, and DMAS does track those CSA children, who they are. But yeah, they would be subject to Medicaid managed care, integration of acute and behavioral health services, and be eligible for those Medicaid services as well. Now, that being said, CSA is somewhat of a separate program. The CSA state general fund dollars end up flowing through to the localities because remember they put up some of the match, and those CSA teams make the decisions on what services they want to wrap around those children. So I wouldn't preclude the use of managed care as an environment to help manage the care of those individuals. I think it's just a little trickier and something I don't think we have gone down the path of yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions in this particular segment? Great. Thank you, Susan. Susan Hogue.
Good morning. I'm going to be your substitute today for Mr. Reynolds' class instruction on school resource and security officers. And good news is I do have his lesson plan that he shared with me earlier. So, that being said, some of you may be familiar with the background of the incentive grant program. It was established back in '99 by the General Assembly in order to encourage localities to hire both resource and security officers in schools that didn't already have them employ them already. SROs are, just to give you the distinction between the two if you don't already know, SROs are certified law enforcement officers, and they are employed by the local law enforcement agencies, and their mission is to provide law enforcement services within the schools. Conversely, for the school security officers, they are employed by the local school divisions in order to maintain discipline and enforce the school board policies for the division. The appropriations for the program have been fairly stable, as you can see by that table, and have totaled $1.3 million in general funds since 2014. However, this past session, the adopted budget did include and reflect an additional $1.3 million in funding for the program in the first fiscal year, which I'll touch on in a minute and a couple other slides. The code authorizes the Juvenile Justice Service Board to establish criteria for making grants from the fund, and the program is currently administered by the Center for School and Campus Safety. According to the policy, grants can be awarded for a maximum of 48 months for a new SRO or SSO position, with, of course, priority given to continuation grants, then to localities requesting positions for schools that don't already have those types of personnel. For FY19 current year, grants have already been awarded, and the maximum award right now is $50,000 for an SRO position and $22,000 for an SSO, including the local match piece to it. Grant funds can only be used for compensation costs of the positions, and the localities are required to provide that match proportionately equal to their local composite school index. On the next slide, looking at that graph, you can see for the FY19 grants have already been awarded, total of that $1.3 million, that required that $600,000 local match, just so you can kind of have that perspective on state funds versus local costs. Individually, those grant awards range was fairly broad in scope. You can see from about $4,400 up to almost $104,000. Again, depending on the local composite index and the cost of the positions requested, and again, the number of positions that they also requested. In total there, you can see on the graph again, there were 38 localities that were awarded grants this year. Sort of dissecting each one of the graphs, columns, you can see outright denials have been relatively rare since about 2016. The graph spike you see there for FY14 or 2014 year is due really to the restarting of the grant program following that substantial reduction in the grants that were available to the program because of the recession that we had experienced. Back in FY18 to 19, though, we see that the number of applications that were just denied because there was a lack of funds went from 7 to 22, and notably, and I'll point out here that those 22 that were just recently denied because we didn't have enough money, 19, they would have been eligible to receive a share of that, the ongoing $1.3 million in grant funds, and DCJS had to assume the 1.3 going forward, and that was sort of a draw the line, if you will, because when they made the grant awards, it was a timing issue. We all hadn't quite gotten to the point of adopting the budget yet, and so they had to go ahead and do the allocations and award the grants for people to plan. So I'm going to touch on the 1.3 here in just a quick second. And then as a result of that additional funds, DCJS did take that opportunity to adopt a new special process that I'm going to go through here. Because that 1.3 additional funding for the program was approved only for that first year, FY19, DCJS solicited applications for just one time 12-month grant, because typically they were 48 months. However, DCJS did say that the recipients of these grants would be eligible for a continuation of their grants if additional dollars are going to be provided during the next up-and-coming session or in the future, if you also determined to do that. Let's see, at the same time, DCJS also, as I mentioned, took this opportunity to sort of revise the application and the guidelines and rules for that particular program that they had established back in the early 2000s. First, localities will be allowed to use an in-kind match to meet their required local dollars. And this will allow them to use the ancillary costs of the positions, like the equipment that they need to have, or the training costs, and not just real cash dollars per se, as they had previously been required. DCJS has also increased the maximum grant award up to $70,000 for an SRO position and up to $35,000 for an SSO position. And that's really to sort of reflect the increased costs associated with those positions, since that previous dollars had been in place since 2004. So you can see where the cost would have gone up in these 14 years. And then lastly, DCJS has decided and said that they would continue to use these new rules in the future funding cycles, regardless of how the appropriations are provided for the program going forward. Let's see, where am I? Just a quick minute here. I lost myself. There we go. Had to skip the lesson plan note, sorry. As for the prevalence of the SROs, most of the school divisions do report using them in their schools to some extent. Across the state, more than 56% of our schools report having SROs in their buildings. And then if we look, and you see there in the middle of the slide, by the school level itself, just over a third of our elementary schools have SROs, compared to more than 92% of our middle schools, and almost 96% of high schools employ them. Just over half of the other types of other school types, like the combined or alternative schools, also have SROs, and that's about 51%. As you can also see, there's variation in the full-time status, which is that last bullet down at the bottom. And in terms of the SROs by school level, with 80 or 90% employed on a full-time basis at middle and high schools, but only 13% are employed on a full-time basis by our elementary schools. Finally, I just want to kind of wrap up and leave you all with a slide that sort of summarizes the funding for the Center for School Safety campus itself. Donna Michaelis came before you all in April, and she went on to say that just to summarize, the center was established back in 2000, had several broad responsibilities set out in code, including providing training for public safety, school personnel, and the development of best practices for the school and campus safety, collection of analysis of school safety data, and conducting school safety audits, which is a lot. These are all in addition to administering the SRO and SSO incentive grant program. Just for perspective, currently the center has 8 positions, and its staff and activities are funded by a combination of both general and non-general fund sources, which you see in the table on the slide. The general fund dollars for the center have been fairly stable and total about $613,000 for FY19, coming from the sources that are listed there for you to take a quick peek at. And then also the center has received varying amounts of federal burn JAG funds in recent years, which totaled altogether about $633,000. So, if you looked at the activities of the center, it appears that the addition of a new or expanded responsibilities will likely require additional funding for both more staff and for program activities in the event that increased training is recommended. So that's sort of it in the nutshell. Good lesson plan. So glad he gave them to me because I was out there by myself. Any questions? Be kind to the substitute.
Yeah, Delegate Landis obviously has not dealt with subs much, but he has a question, so. No, I had a question. Delegate Marshall, I'm sorry. Yeah. Falsely accused you, Delegate.
Susan, statewide, do you know the number of SROs and also the number of SSO that are out there?
Where have I seen? I think it was back in a presentation that I've seen earlier this year, and we can get those numbers to you.
Would I assume correctly there are more SROs than there are SSOs?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You would be correct. I do know that.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I will follow up and get that information to the
Thank
committee.
you. Any other questions? Great, Susan, great fill-in. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And don't forget about all the appendices. It's really good information in
Yeah,
there.
it really is. Well, we really
A plug for
appreciate,
the,
appreciate the two Susans. So let's move on to sort of the heart of what we're doing today, and that's the subcommittee recommendations. I'm going to recognize Delegate Danny Marshall, who serves as our vice chair, and our committee and liaison between the subcommittees and the full committees. And Danny's been very active with all the subcommittees, so he's going to give us a little information on that particular topic. Danny?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to, first of all, thank everyone who's participated this summer. A lot of hard work and a lot of good information that's come before us. But good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Select Committee on School Safety. The purpose of today's meeting is to hear from the House Appropriations Committee and staff current funding levels for school safety that we just did. First off, I want to make a few comments about how today's process will work, and then we'll get some general comments about the progress of our committee. I was impressed that we were developing these recommendations. We tried to avoid overlaps where we could help. But you hear some themes repeated today by each one of the subcommittee chairs. Collaboration is a theme that we have heard continuously, and it is critical that our schools and law enforcement and emergency services and also our students and parents are collaborating to ensure our schools remain safe and spaces for learning. Innovation is another theme, Mr. Speaker, and sometimes good policy requires thinking outside of the box, and school safety is one of those areas where it helps to be creative. We need to be constantly looking at ways to improve. We shouldn't be afraid to find creative and outside-of-the-box solutions. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, we found that school safety isn't a one-size-fits-all issue. Our school varies across the state, just like our localities do, and it's important that when analyzing policies that we ensure we provide flexibility for the schools to do what is best for their children. So we'll start with the Delegate Nick Rush with Infrastructure and Security. Nick, thank you for your leadership on this and thank you for your hard work.
Thank you, Danny. Good morning, Mr. Speaker and members of the committee. The Infrastructure and Security Subcommittee was tasked with looking at ways to strengthen school security via the use of innovative technology, proven security mechanisms, and general industry best practices. In total, our subcommittee met 4 times and heard from over a dozen stakeholders and industry professionals about the trends in school security, from the design of school buildings to the use of software applications. I'd like to thank Vice Chairman Marshall and members of my subcommittee for their commitment to this important work. Before we walk through each recommendation, I want to spend some time and highlight a few proposals that I think really stand out. First, our subcommittee heard from several vendors that provide mobile applications designed specifically for school safety. This technology can be accessed by school personnel via the use of smartphone, tablet, or desktop computers and connects directly to law enforcement and emergency services. Our other recommendation is that each school division utilize some form of a mobile emergency or crisis communication application. Further, Mr. Speaker, it may be helpful if our committee could ask the Department of General Services and the Department of Education to be available to assist local school divisions with procurement needs, whether that is in the form of a list of vendors, help with RFPs, or general pricing guidelines. Our state agencies obviously have a lot of experience with procurement, and I want to make sure some of our smaller school divisions in particular get the assistance they need. The second recommendation I want to highlight, Mr. Speaker, is the need to increase funding for School Resource Officer Grant Program. She stole my thunder. This grant program provides funding for SRO positions and has previously been funded at $1.3 million per year. The House this past session recognized the importance of this program and increased funding to $2.6 million for the current fiscal year to fund applications that have been denied in the past simply for lack of funding. Moving forward, there will be an increased demand on this grant program as school divisions seek to place SROs and SSOs in their schools. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, our subcommittee heard one common theme throughout our work, and that theme was collaboration. You'll see that several of our recommendations focusing on ensuring schools, law enforcement, emergency services, procurement, and builders all collaborate on school safety planning. If a school identifies the need for new door locks, for example, the procurement team should be working closely with EMS and fire officials to ensure that those new locks meet current code requirements. This theme of collaboration was something that we found in many of McDonald's task force recommendations as well. Mr. Speaker, I want to again thank you for the opportunity to lead this subcommittee and to work on this important issue. Staff will now walk through each of our subcommittee recommendations. Thank you.
Charles, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. So these are the recommendations from the Infrastructure and Security Subcommittee. Recommendation number 1 is to recommend that school boards provide all school board employees with access to mobile push applications. Mobile push applications allow school board employees to use their enabled electronic devices to quickly communicate with first responders during emergency situations. Recommendation number 2, recommend that school boards provide web-based anonymous tip applications to school board employees, students, and students' parents. The Commonwealth or local school divisions should procure a web-based anonymous tip application that would permit school board employees, students, and students' parents to anonymously notify school administration and law enforcement of potential emergency situations that involve public, elementary, and secondary schools and students. Recommendation number 3, recommend that school boards explore the possibility of purchasing ballistic barriers and installing such barriers in school buildings. Innovations in ballistic barrier technology have enabled functional educational items such as dry erase whiteboards to be made bulletproof. Recommendation number 4, recommend integrating school security cameras with emergency communication centers. Recommendation number 5, increase funding for the School Resource Officer Grants Program. As mentioned, the program is funded at $1.3 million per year for the current biennium, but the budget for the current fiscal year includes an additional $1.3 million to fund the acceptance of grant applications that were previously denied solely for lack of funding. An additional increase in funding for the second year of the current biennium will enable the General Assembly to meet the growing demand for program funds. Recommendation number 6, increase funding made available to eligible school divisions pursuant to the School Security Equipment Grant of 2013. The Virginia Public School Authority is permitted to issue up to $6 million in notes for each year of the current biennium to fund grants pursuant to the Act. In addition to increasing such funding, the General Assembly may also consider amending the Act to allow eligible school divisions to purchase a broader range of school security items than it is permitted under current law. Recommendation number 7, amend Section 9.1, 110 of the Code of Virginia to permit private elementary and secondary schools in the Commonwealth to apply for and receive grants pursuant to the School Resource Officer Grants Program. There is a growing demand for school resource officers among private elementary and secondary schools in the Commonwealth. Recommendation number 8, require each school board to collaborate with local fire departments to annually review building and fire codes for each elementary and secondary school in the local school division. Such a review would facilitate full compliance with the then current fire code and would greatly enhance the safety of each public elementary and secondary school in the Commonwealth. Recommendation number 9, recommend that the Department of Criminal Justice Services establish best practices for each annual safety-related review that school boards are required to perform. These best practices would cover annual reviews such as school safety audits and school crisis, emergency management, and medical response plans. Recommendation number 10, require certain minimum security standards for all public elementary and secondary schools. Minimum standards for instruction, student achievement, and staffing levels have been established by the General Assembly pursuant to statute and by the Board of Education pursuant to regulation. Likewise, the Board of Education should establish minimum standards for the security of all public elementary and secondary schools in the Commonwealth with the input of stakeholders. Such standards should include standards for both physical security and cybersecurity. Recommendation number 11, require school crisis, emergency management, and medical emergency response plans to be developed and reviewed collaboratively by school boards and first responders. Under the current law, each school board is required to develop and annually review a school crisis, emergency management, and medical emergency response plan. It is unclear whether school boards have historically sought or currently seek to collaborate with first responders in the development and review of such plans, but such collaboration would be beneficial. Recommendation number 12, recommend that the Commonwealth or school boards explore the possibility of procuring a social media monitoring program or service. Social media monitoring programs and services help school divisions throughout the country to better assess security risks within schools. Recommendation 13, require a professional who is trained and experienced in crime prevention through environmental design, review, and implementation to review each school building project, including new construction and renovation projects. CEPTED promotes both increased security and better educational environments for learning. This was a recommendation from the 2013 Governor's School and Campus Safety Task Force. It was recommended but not implemented, and the subcommittee has decided to recommend this again. Recommendation 14, localities should establish consensus-driven stakeholder processes for school design and security planning that include public safety personnel, architects, engineers, school officials, and others who may have experience and expertise with school safety audits. Again, this was a recommendation of the 2013 Governor's School and Campus Safety Task Force. Recommendation 15, require public safety agencies to coordinate the inclusion of local school divisions in the Public Safety Voice Communication System. The 2013 Governor's School and Campus Safety Task Force recommended that public safety agencies coordinate the inclusion of school divisions into the Public Safety Voice Communication System, but did not recommend that such inclusion be required. And recommendation 16, design professionals, school officials, police chiefs, sheriffs, fire officials, and building officials should form a team at a local level to avoid conflicts in law and regulations when educational occupancy is having any type of security and infrastructure improvements for new or existing educational occupancies. And again, this was another recommendation from the 2013 Governor's School and Campus Safety Task Force.
Okay, just to make sure everyone understands the process, I'm going to ask Delegate Rush to make a motion at this point. The motion will be to basically adopt these recommendations in a block. Let me remind you that, once again, what we're doing, because I don't want to confuse anyone, it's been a collaborative effort, so we're basically putting everything on the table. Our intent then is, in working with the committee over the next 2 months, I mean, obviously, if you take all of these together, and there are some great ones, the funding piece would be pretty prohibitive. So we're going to have to work with, obviously, the vice chairman and chairman of appropriations, et cetera, to call this list down a little bit. That will be done in the November meeting. If you look at some of the recommendations, they're great. Some need to be fleshed out a little bit more. There's a little bit of overlap, not a lot. I think we've done a good job on that. If you obviously want to have some input as far as fleshing out some of those things, obviously get with staff, Alex, et cetera. So that's sort of where we're at. I want to make sure everybody sort of understands the parameters. So Delegate Rush, why don't you make the motion, and then we'll get a second, and then we'll have any discussion.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the committee receive the Infrastructure Security Subcommittee recommendation.
Okay, there's a motion and a second, so let's open that up for discussion. Okay, once again, it's a block vote on all the recommendations.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Delegate Toscano.
So I'm glad I heard the motion as to receive, because we're not accepting these. There are.
Yeah, that's really a good point. And
Yeah.
once again, the best probably analogy I have is when JLARC does a report, they have great recommendations. Frankly, if you look at some of them, there are probably 2 or 3 we don't always agree with, and you probably will look in the actual report, they're not pushed forward. We came up with, I think, a very good solution to receive the report, puts them in the bosom of the committee, and so then we can sort of work on those in the next 2 or 3 months and then decide more specifically what we want to do.
Thank you. Follow-up question,
Delegate
Speaker.
Toscano.
So we got the presentation just this morning. We don't have anything in paper, so it's hard to assess the questions that we have. I assume we're going to get something on paper so we can look at that. But in any event, well, I don't have it in paper. How much time do you want to spend today going over some of these things? Because I think there are a number of questions that people may want to raise.
Well, I think the recommendations have been distributed. Yeah, I think if you look through your,
Those are mine from my subcommittee, but I don't have.
I'm sorry, I don't have them, so.
we've
Somebody
got plenty, I
provide
guess.
me a
Yeah,
copy.
we'll make sure.
But how much time do you want to spend on this today, Mr. Chairman?
Well, I would say that, once again, I think one of the reasons why we're doing sort of a block vote on simply accepting them, sort of receiving them, I think today probably is not the day you want to spend 2 hours debating each one. We're more than happy, once again, if you say on recommendation 5, I think you should expand it to X, or on recommendation 6, I prefer doing guidance counselors this way. We obviously have a lot of time to do that. This is September, and we won't actually get to that vote till November. So I think the theory was, let's go ahead and get everything in front of you, and then we'll have various ways to give you input to make sure we know what your priorities are and what sort of bubbles to the top. That's the theory.
Okay, Mr.
I mean,
Chairman.
if you have something that you feel strongly about, chime in now. But I think if we go through every single proposal, we're going to be here till 4 o'clock. And
Well, I don't want to be here until 4
Yes,
o'clock.
Delegate Scott.
And I understand the rationale, so I guess I would just speak to the motion.
Doug Toscano.
So I will support. Oh, it's all right, okay. I'll support the motion, but I do have some questions about number 3, which has to do with mobile push applications.
Sure.
Number 5, the ballistic barriers. And then one that I heard that I really having a hard time getting my arms around is the notion that somehow we would extend taxpayer dollars to private schools who want to put SROs in their schools. And I don't know why that is there, but I guess we can take it up at some further time.
Yeah, and once again, I can say there are probably 2 or 3 I can point out to you immediately that probably aren't my favorites. I think what we were trying to do is be inclusive in the first round. And so what I didn't want to do in the first round is go, we're just going to sort of, arbitrarily take this one out. So I think what we did was, if the idea was presented to the subcommittee, we sort of put it in the packet. And once again, the best will bubble to the top, I think, through discussion, et cetera. And we just thought that was the best process. We thought it was too early in September, even today, to have a big knockdown, drag-out debate. You haven't really had a chance, as you said, to really look through them. So I think the dilemma you would have then would be you to be dating something you've seen for some of you for the first time. Hopefully your subcommittees, talked about these. So I think this process will work. And so once again, it gives us about 2 months to, look over them. Delegate Rush.
And Mr. Chairman, another thing, it also allows the public now to see the recommendation, or the recommendations that have been received by the full committee, so then we can get public comment from our constituents on, some of the items that Delegate Scott brought up.
Delegate Jones.
Chairman, I would just to echo your comments and talking offline with the Vice Chairman, we'll have an opportunity as Appropriations Committee and staff to look at that and try to assign, dollar value. And then as we go through this process over the next month or so, then we can say these are our priorities. We did double the amount during the conference process for the first year, to another 1.3. Of course, on the phone this morning with Secretary of Finance, we're going to probably spend about $50–60 million just on preparation for the hurricane. We opened up 3 emergency shelters down in Hampton Roads because we got a mandatory evacuation. So all the dollars will come, flowing back in or out, and we got to just see where we are come, January.
Okay, any other questions? Don't want to hurry the process. Any other questions?
Mr. Speaker.
Yes. Yes, Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Real quick on the issue of the budget, are we going to have, when we get all these, because you're right, there's a huge budget impact if we took all of them, are we going to have options on each one? So say the school resource officer funding, right? Will we have, here's option A, here's option B, here's option C, so that we're seeing a variety of different impacts and what influence they will have? I'm thinking about counselors. So it's not just this dollar amount or nothing, but there's grades?
My guess is how the process will work is, and we're working at that a little bit, but generally what we sort of do in this is, and, obviously, I see Delegate Torian and, Delegate Rush, a bunch of other people in our appropriations. Generally what we do is sort of go, to be candid, as Delegate Jones and Delegate Landis have said, they've got other things. So maybe trying to come up with a dollar figure of this is probably what we can do on school safety. And then I think from there, sort of get back with the committee and say, okay, if you, to your point, maybe not quite option 1, 2, 3, 4, but you're correct. On SROs, we went from 1.3 to 2.6. We want to sustain that funding. Is that where we want to put our priority? And that type of thing. But I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think what we're looking from the committee is, we'll be working with staff. So I think to some degree we can give some options, but I don't want to say it'll be so formalized that we're probably going to give you 4 or 5 options on each one. But you make a great point. I mean, take the guidance counselor issue. You've got the ratio issue. You've got the support cap issue, or then you've just got the straight issue of, which is probably the cheapest, is trying to make sure they're doing the job they're assigned to do. So they're not doing testing coordinator jobs, et cetera. Now that still costs some money because you got to have more testing coordinators, probably the one that would cost the least. So is that what we want to do in that space? Or do we want to go further than that? So I guess that's, that's the thought. Others, yes, Delegate Rush.
Mr. Speaker, Delegate Peace had a good idea that he said we could possibly tweak the website so you could, public could give comments on the recommendations, on each recommendation. So Alex is saying we don't need to tweak it, so not a good idea, Pete.
I think, as I recall, the website's set up specifically by subcommittee. And so it probably set up where you can do those motions. But great idea, Delegate Peace. Okay, any others? It's a tough crowd. All right, well, thank y'all very much. I think we have the motion and the second on adopting in a block the Infrastructure and Security Subcommittee. All those in favor of that motion, signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. And they are adopted. Good question. So now let's go on to Delegate Landis, who would chair the Student Behavior and Intervention Subcommittee. And he is going to deal with that particular issue.
Well, good morning, Mr. Speaker and members of the committee. The Student Behavior and Intervention Subcommittee was tasked with developing policies to improve school safety that focus specifically on student behavior, intervention, and interaction. This includes students interacting with teachers, school personnel, and school resource officers, as well as students interacting with each other. One clear and unfortunate observation of our work, and one that we probably all knew before this process started, is that bullying takes place all too often in many forms. I mention that because I believe establishing a subcommittee that focuses primarily on our students and our school climates was incredibly important to ensure that this committee takes a holistic approach to the issue of school safety. And Mr. Speaker, I want to commend you and the Select Committee for having us focus and put attention on that. Over the past several months, we've heard from school climate and school safety experts from academia, school counselors, and mental health professionals, and directly from students themselves. Our recommendations are comprehensive, inclusive, and represent everything that we heard. Some of our recommendations seek to solve the same problem in different ways, and some have significant costs associated with them, as has been alluded to. Therefore, it will be up to us, the full committee, and subsequently the General Assembly, to analyze and debate these issues fully. Today, we simply propose them for your consideration. First, Mr. Speaker, our subcommittee recommends mandated training for school resource officers, threat assessment team members, and school personnel. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to highlight three of what I think are the most important recommendations that we will go into in more detail. Currently, this training is available through the Center for School and Campus Safety. However, the Code of Virginia does not require it. It is critical that everyone involved in school safety, whether on the planning and prevention side, the day-to-day student interaction side, or the response side, should receive the same training. Mr. Speaker, the second recommendation I would like to highlight relates to school climate. One question that continued to come up during the work that we had was, do we really have a good grasp on what's going on inside our schools? For example, bullying, which used to be easy to spot, is now amplified and yet also hidden by social media and our students' constant interconnectivity. And the students talked a lot about that. Our subcommittee invited 9 high school students from 4 different schools to speak about their experiences and perceptions of school bullying or school safety. Bullying through social media and students' ability to cope with bullying, peer pressure, and stress were top of mind of the students that we heard from. One way we can track what is going on inside our schools is through a school climate survey that asks students and school personnel to provide feedback on important issues, such as whether a school feels safe or whether students feel that they have someone to talk to in an event of a mental health emergency. Currently, Virginia's School Climate Survey is being conducted by the University of Virginia's Dr. Dewey Cornell through the use of research grant that they've been receiving that will expire in 2020. Dr. Cornell's work has been instrumental in the school safety space and has been a great resource for the subcommittee. We recommend that the Commonwealth implement an annual statewide school climate survey so that we can track key indicators such as student and staff perceptions of discipline, engagement, and relationships. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, our subcommittee recognized the importance of counseling. You'll see in our report several recommendations that address school counseling. However, I want to emphasize that I feel what I feel is an innovative solution to the issue. We heard that school counselors are all too often being asked or tasked with administrative responsibilities, such as coordinating testing, which prevents them from actually providing counseling services to students, as you mentioned, Mr. Speaker. One proposal that was floated around in years past was to simply add more school counselors. But if counselors aren't counseling, does adding more really solve the problem? I would propose, Mr. Speaker, that we instead make a concerted effort to realign the responsibility of our school counselors, who I remind everyone are specially trained and highly educated, so that they spend the majority of their time counseling students. That may create a void administratively, but I believe that and I know you do too, Mr. Speaker, that it would be better to hire testing coordinators to coordinate tests and school counselors to counsel. Therefore, we are recommending, and I hope the committee will look favorably upon, realigning the responsibilities of school counselors so that they can devote time to providing much-needed counseling services to students. Mr. Speaker, before I call Ryan up to present the remaining recommendations in detail, 24 in total, I want to thank the members of the subcommittee for their work and for their attendance and participation. And we really did, Mr. Speaker, enjoy hearing from the students and getting a firsthand account of what they're seeing in their schools. So, Mr. Speaker, with your permission now to ask Ryan to come forward and go and review in detail our recommendations.
Thank you, Delegate Landis. Ryan? I certainly want to thank Ryan and Charles for their very hard work on this project.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Select Committee. The Student Behavior and Intervention Subcommittee recommends that the full Select Committee receive the following 24 recommendations. Recommendation number 1, mandatory training for threat assessment team members. While the Center for School and Campus Safety frequently offers threat assessment training throughout the Commonwealth, the Code of Virginia does not mandate the participation of threat assessment team members. Recommendation number 2, mandatory threat assessment training for all school personnel. Again, these are frequently offered trainings through the Center for School and Campus Safety, but the code does not mandate the participation of all school personnel either. Recommendation number 3, increase funding to the Center for School and Campus Safety to provide more training, technical assistance, and resources on threat assessment. Again, the trainings are frequent, but these additional resources would allow for the implementation of recommendations 1 and 2. Recommendation 4, standardized threat assessment data collection. The Code of Virginia requires each threat assessment team to report quantitative data on its activities to DCJS. A standardized data collection and reporting template would help DCJS interpret the data and would assist schools and divisions as students change schools. Recommendation number 5, increase funding to the Center for School and Campus Safety to build capacity to analyze safety data collected from schools. The center does not currently have the budget to hire staff with the expertise to perform such a task. Recommendation number 6, decouple the assessment of student threats to self from the assessment of student threats to others in the current threat assessment procedures, but coordinate these assessments when they co-occur. The Code of Virginia requires threat assessment teams to assess threats of violence or physical harm to both self and others. There's evidence that threat assessment teams spend the majority of their time and resources on threats to self, for which there are already another set of procedures in place. Recommendation number 7 requires statewide implementation of a school climate survey, an annual survey of staff and students in grades 6 through 12 by the Center for School and Campus Safety. This survey is currently performed by the University of Virginia pursuant to grant funds that are set to expire in 2020. The school climate survey is a valuable tool for measuring school safety and student and staff perceptions of discipline, engagement, and relationships. Recommendation 8, provide funding for staff and training relating to de-escalation of student misconduct through positive behavior intervention and supports. Positive behavior intervention and supports is a tiered approach for the selection and use of evidence-based behavior interventions to promote school safety and improve student behavior. Recommendation 9, provide funding to strengthen existing school-based mentor programs or establish new school-based mentor programs for students whose behavior may pose a risk to self or others. Recommendation 10, promote the implementation of restorative justice programs as an alternative to exclusionary discipline and referrals to law enforcement to address disparities and rates of such disciplinary actions among minority students and students with disabilities. School division disciplinary actions should address the root causes of the students' negative behaviors and seek reconciliation between perpetrators and victims. Recommendation 11, remove the funding cap on support staff in order to increase opportunities for school divisions to hire additional aides, counselors, psychologists, and other specialists. The General Assembly has had in place since the recession a cap on the standards of quality funding levels for support staff, many of whom provide critical services to promote student health and safety. The subcommittee notes that there's a significant fiscal impact to this recommendation. Recommendation 12, lower the ratio of school counselors to students. The Code of Virginia sets a ratio of 1 school counselor to 350 high school students, 1 to 400 middle school students, and 1 to 500 elementary school students. The Virginia Counselor Association and American School Counselor Association recommend at least 1 school counselor for every 250 students in elementary and secondary schools. Recommendation 13, require school counselors to spend a minimum of 80% of staff time providing direct student services. School counselors across the Commonwealth are burdened with administrative duties such as test coordination and report that they do not have sufficient time to counsel students. Recommendation number 14 is to create new positions such as a test coordinator to relieve school counselors of those additional administrative duties and ensure that they have sufficient time to provide counseling services. Recommendation 15, include mental health counselors in the standards of quality. Provide the state share of funding for local school divisions to hire counselors with backgrounds or training in mental health. Some school divisions are currently hiring such individuals with local funds, and the subcommittee notes a significant fiscal impact to that recommendation as well. Recommendation 16, provide funding for enhanced wraparound mental health services in schools, such as suicide prevention and trauma-informed schooling. Trauma-informed schooling is a well-developed nationwide approach to school policy enforcement and revision that helps mitigate outcomes that are destructive to student health and safety. Recommendation 17, require mental health screening or annual or semi-annual mental health wellness checks for students at certain grade levels. Students reported to the subcommittee at its last meeting that both early and frequent, especially in the middle and high school years, mental health screenings and checkups would be beneficial for student well-being and support. Recommendation 18, promote peer advisory teams for new students. Some school divisions provide new students with peer advisory teams consisting of students, teachers, and other staff members to ease the transition and mitigate the negative experiences that new students often face, such as bullying and isolation that may lead to mental health issues. Recommendation 19, require mental health to be taught as a component of any family life education program offered in a local school division. A family life education, an optional local program of instruction, currently includes a wide array of topics, but the topic of mental health is not currently mandated. Recommendation 20, require mental health training for teachers. Mental health is an emerging issue in schools, and it's important that teachers are trained to identify and assist students suffering from mental health challenges. Recommendation 21, require school crisis, emergency management, and medical emergency response plans to place more emphasis on the recovery phase of crisis response. Such plans should ensure that in the time period after crisis response, sufficient attention is paid to the potential mental health and community consequences of that crisis. Recommendation 22, require memoranda of understanding between law enforcement and school divisions, and also require those memoranda of understanding to be reviewed and potentially updated at least once every 5 years. Many, but not all, local school divisions have memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement agencies that clearly delineate procedures and expectations relating to school safety. Recommendation 23, require training for school resource officers with a wider array of topics, including student mental health, interacting with students with disabilities, bullying, and interacting with parents. Survey data shows that school resource officers, in order to fulfill their duties as law enforcement officers, community liaisons, law-related educators, mentors, and role models, believe that they would benefit from additional training on these topics. And finally, recommendation 24, require annual school-wide or annual classroom-by-classroom training for students on school safety procedures. Students reported to the subcommittee that in instances in which this type of training was provided, they felt safer and better prepared for the possibility of unsafe situations at school.
Delegate Landis.
Mr. Speaker, I would move that the Select Committee receive the Student Behavior and Interventions Subcommittee recommendations.
Delegate Marshall seconds that motion. Any discussion on the motion to receive the recommendations and block of the Student Behavior and Intervention Subcommittee? Hearing none, all those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. That motion carries. Ryan, thank you very much. Delegate Landis, thanks for your very hard work on this subcommittee. So let's go on to Delegate Peace, who's been the chairman of the Prevention and Response Protocol Subcommittee, who will give that subcommittee report.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, members of the subcommittee, members of our committee. The Prevention and Response Protocol Subcommittee was charged with developing recommendations to improve school safety that focus on ways school systems and community partners like law enforcement can work to prevent incidents, and also how all stakeholders can effectively respond to emergencies in and around our schools. We had a productive and thorough work process, meeting several times, and I'm pleased to share with you today nearly 20 recommendations that our subcommittee generated from stakeholder input, staff analysis, and constituent feedback. I'd like to thank our staff, Charles Quagliato, for all of his support, as well as Alex Thorpe for their great input and support. My focus will be on 3 policy recommendations that I think are most significant and that will directly contribute to improving school safety. Our subcommittee heard many of the same concerns regarding student mental health that I've heard relayed from the other subcommittee chairmen. This is no doubt one of our most pressing issues. To that end, one of our subcommittee's recommendations is for school boards to enter into cooperative agreements with the Department of Social Services and Community Services boards to provide mental health and community-based services for students struggling with mental health issues. This recommendation comes directly from concerns we've heard that students, teachers, and parents are often unsure where to turn when a student is experiencing mental health problems that need care beyond what can be provided in the school setting. Next, I want to highlight our recommendation that the General Assembly make statutory changes to retirement provisions for law enforcement officers to allow for retired officers to re-enter the workforce as school resource officers and not lose their retirement benefits. This recommendation is a real opportunity to address several important issues. School resource officers are in high demand, and not all local law enforcement agencies can provide SROs for each school. For some smaller or rural localities, providing an SRO could mean taking a much-needed officer off patrol. We've also heard that many retired law enforcement officers are interested in returning to work in an SRO capacity and would do so if not for this retirement impediment. With this reform, we would increase the number of SROs, reduce the strain on law enforcement agencies, and ensure that we have experienced and highly trained sworn professionals working with our students. The last recommendation I would like to note deals with both the prevention and the response side of incidents. Our subcommittee, working with Delegate Glenn Davis, arranged for a video conference with a member of the Utah State Senate who was instrumental in starting Safe UT, an anonymous tip and chat line aimed at preventing teen suicide and school violence. The entire subcommittee was very impressed with what Utah has been able to accomplish. and are encouraged by their early results. We recommend that Virginia establish a commission that will begin to explore the development of a statewide mobile application and chat line that provides a safe platform for students to access mental health services and alert authorities of school safety threats. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Later, I'll ask the Select Committee to receive our recommendations. I'll ask Charles to come and present our full list of recommendations. I appreciate the opportunity to chair the subcommittee and work on this important issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Delegate Peace. Charles?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recommendations from the Prevention and Response Protocol Subcommittee. The first recommendation is to require the use of memorandum of understandings between each local school board and relevant local law enforcement agencies regarding the use of school resource officers. The mandatory use of such MOUs would ensure that school boards and law enforcement agencies have clear expectations and well-defined responsibilities regarding SROs. In school divisions in which such MOUs are currently not used, there may be a lack of clarity regarding the expectations for and responsibilities of SROs. Recommendation number 2 is to increase funding for the School Resource Officer Grants Program. As previously discussed, the program is funded as $1.3 million per year for the current biennium, and the budget has for the current fiscal year an additional $1.3 million to fund the acceptance of grant applications that were previously denied solely for lack of funding. An increase in funding for the second year of the current biennium will enable the General Assembly to meet the growing demand for program funds. Recommendation number 3 is to increase funding for mental health services in public elementary and secondary schools. There are many reports of increased mental health issues in schools, and there are many different existing programs focused on mental health services in schools, and there may be opportunities to increase funding for these programs to ensure that there are adequate resources available in each school. Recommendation number 4 is to recommend cooperative agreements between school boards and the Department of Social Services and Community Services boards to provide mental health and community-based services for students who need such services. Such cooperative agreements would ensure that additional resources are available to address the mental health issues that may arise in public elementary and secondary schools. Recommendation number 5 is to recommend that all localities enter into mutual aid agreements with other localities to provide emergency services. Such mutual aid agreements would establish expectations and promote the availability of additional assistance in emergency situations. Recommendation number 6, recommend that the school board employees who are responsible for procurement work with local fire marshals to ensure that any infrastructure improvements comply with the statewide fire prevention code. Currently, school board employees who are responsible for procurement may purchase items to increase building security, such as doors and door locks, that do not comply with the statewide fire prevention code. Recommendation number 7, require all school board employees to complete crisis intervention team training to permit non-security and non-instructional personnel to complete such training online. Increasing CIT training will allow school board employees to more easily recognize school mental health issues and de-escalate them in a timely manner. Recommendation 8 is to recommend that the Board of Education amend its regulations establishing the standards of accreditation to permit school counselors to return to providing counseling services. Many schools require school counselors to perform administrative responsibilities, such as testing coordination, but the increase in behavioral health issues in school settings necessitates the standards of accreditation to be amended to require that school counselors spend a certain percentage of their staff time providing counselor services. The other administrative responsibilities that are currently assigned to school counselors should be reassigned. Recommendation number 9, amend the statutory provisions relating to the retirement of law enforcement officers so that retired law enforcement officers can serve as SROs. Currently, retired law enforcement officers cannot work as SROs and receive their retiree benefits. A change to the law enforcement retirement statutes could allow retired law enforcement officers to work as SROs and still receive retiree benefits. Recommendation number 10 is to increase funding to the Department of Criminal Justice Services for additional school safety training programs and personnel. Additional funding would allow DCJS to provide more school safety training programs. Additional funding would likely include an increase in funded positions within DCJS. Recommendation number 11 is amend the Virginia Juvenile Community Crime Control Act so that community services can be provided to juveniles before they are brought before the court on a complaint or petition. The Virginia Juvenile Community Crime Control Act provides funding for the diversion of youth offenders from the Department of Juvenile Justice to a community-based program. Currently, the act only applies to children brought before the court. Amending this act will allow at-risk youth to receive community services and support before they are brought before the court. Recommendation number 12, recommend increased collaboration among various stakeholders in school safety audits and crisis management planning. Currently, school boards are required to perform school safety audits and develop and review crisis management plans. It is unclear whether school boards have historically sought or currently seek to collaborate with first responders in the performance of such audits and the development and review of such plans, but such collaboration would be beneficial. Recommendation number 13, recommend the development or purchase of an anonymous suicide tip chat mobile application. Recommend that the Commonwealth or school board explore the possibility of procuring a mobile application for the anonymous reporting of threats of suicide and other mental health issues. Recommendation number 14, establish a commission to explore the development of a Commonwealth-run suicide hotline mobile application, similar to the Safe Utah program. The Safe UT Crisis Text and Tip Line is a statewide service in Utah that provides real-time crisis intervention to youth through texting and a mobile application for confidential tips. The Commonwealth should establish a commission to explore the feasibility of a similar Commonwealth-run service. Recommendation 15 is to lower the ratio of school counselors to students in public elementary and secondary schools. The current school counselor ratio ranges from 1 to 350 students to 1 to 500 students, depending on the school level. The Virginia School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 1 to 250 in all public elementary and secondary schools in the Commonwealth. And the subcommittee knows this has a significant fiscal impact. Recommendation number 16 is to provide funding for the Delinquency Prevention and Youth Development Act. The Delinquency Prevention and Youth Development Act was defunded in 2004. If the act is funded, it may allow at-risk youth to receive community services and support before they are brought before the court. Recommendation number 17 is to change the date of primary elections held in June from the second Tuesday in June to the third Tuesday in June. This date change will enhance controlled access to schools during the school year. Currently, June primary elections occur during the school year in many localities. Pushing such primary elections to the third week in June would ensure that the elections occur after the school year has ended. And there is another recommendation that was developed this morning at the subcommittee meeting, which would be recommendation 18, which would essentially provide Election Day in November as a school holiday.
Great. Delegate Peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the Select Committee on School Safety receive the recommendations from the Prevention and Response Protocol Subcommittee.
And there's a second from Delegate Marshall. Okay, any discussion on that motion?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Delegate Jones.
if I may, I know that this is the last of the three presentations. I've been trying to do calculation in my mind of each recommendation, and my head's spinning a little bit. So what I think, this is informational for me, I would like for staff to be able to take the recommendations and walk through and look and assign a price tag, because I do think it's very important for us to have that. I know when JLARC does their work, they will typically come back and give us some associated cost at times. So I think that would be helpful and instructive for the select committee when we get back together to make a final decision in November. There's, like Delegate Toscano, I've got some questions. I'll hold them till later on some of the recommendations, because I see some redundancy here, and I'm not sure why we have some recommendations before us. I don't think that's the appropriate time right now to go into that, but I would like, if that would be okay with the speaker and the chairman, so we can start that process. So when we get to that point, we'll be able to assign value to what we're looking to do.
I think that's a very good idea. And once again, even though I know some of them are close, I think we're trying to be inclusive. And even if you look at the mobile app piece, which is sort of interesting, what the University of Utah did, you know, you could decide to go with more a school-based system. You can go with more of what Utah did, et cetera. So some of those are pretty close, and we're going to have to make decisions, you know, sort of where we want to go. But we'll do that, Delegate Jones. That's a good suggestion. And if I could also mention for the vote, Alex, raise your hand also. And let me also sort of point out, Alex Thorpe on my staff, you know, is also really helped staff this. So if you have anything, please get that to him also, besides Charles and Ryan. So we have the motion on the floor dealing with receiving the recommendation of block for the Prevention and Response Protocol Subcommittee, chaired by Delegate Peace, and a second. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Okay, that motion carries. So let me make some quick closing remarks, and then I'll certainly open it up to any comment, because I know several members are going to have comment. Let me give you some program notes, and then I'll open it up. We plan, as I've sort of said, to meet again as a full committee in November. Tentatively, we're planning on meeting November 14th, immediately following the House Appropriations retreat at James Madison. At that meeting, we'll finalize our recommendations to be included in the final report. I know we're still sorting through some scheduling concerns with that November date, so please be on the lookout for further guidance from staff. And with that, I know we probably have members who want to make comments. Delegate Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comment refers to the last two reports that we received. I raised it in subcommittee, but I feel the need to put it on the table again. I would really appreciate staff doing an assessment of whether there's a problem of sharing information between the schools and the community services boards, between schools if a student is transferred. There are a number of these recommendations where on an individual student basis, I think it would be important to have a good answer on any restrictions, either regulatory or by law.
Thank you, Delegate Watts. Anyone else would like to make a comment before the chair entertains a motion to adjourn? Hearing none, chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved. Is there a second? All those in favor of that motion, signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. We stand adjourned. Let me thank you all very much for your attendance. Let me thank particularly the subcommittee chairs, Delegate Marshall, for your hard work as vice chairman. And so thanks so much for attending. We stand adjourned.